Welcome to Thinking Green. This week we're going to kind of continue on the topics that we've been devoting our time to since the election, trying to focus on groups of people and on issues that seem particularly vulnerable and threatened as a result of the results of our recent presidential election. And so tonight's show is going to have a little bit of a twist. My guest is Beth Caruso, and she wrote a book called One of Windsor, which is about witch hangings in Connecticut, which is something that I really didn't even know happened. So welcome, Beth.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Well, I'm glad you could come down and be on. But I am curious. I'm from Philadelphia, not from Connecticut, but my kids went to school in Connecticut, and I knew nothing about witch hangings in Connecticut. You know, Salem, everyone knows.
Yes.
But, so how did you get interested in this subject or even become aware of it?
Well, I'm also not from Connecticut. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I moved here when my husband got a job at CCSU. We moved to Windsor, Connecticut. And like you, I had only heard of the Salem witch trials until one day my neighbor said, "Do you realize that the very first American witch hanging victim was from this town?" And I was blown away. I was absolutely astonished. I thought, the very first witch hanging victim in all of the colonies, and no one has heard her name before. Even in the town of Windsor, there were only, maybe half the townspeople, maybe less, had ever even heard of Alse Young. So I became obsessed. I thought, I have to learn something about her. But there are really no trial records, and there's not a lot of information. So I really had to do a lot of digging, and it led to 2 years of research.
And the title, One of Windsor, is that sort of a reflection of how hard it is to find out who this person is?
Well, Alse Young, we know the name now, but that is because of the Matthew Grant diary, which was the town record or the church record for the town of Windsor, but it had gotten lost and it wasn't found again till the late 1800s. So we knew there was a woman who was hanged for witchcraft because John Winthrop, who was governor of Massachusetts, kept a diary, and in it he said, "One blank of Windsor, arraigned and executed as a witch in Hartford and around the time in 1647. Well, fast forward over 200 years, people had no idea who this woman was until someone was walking in the rubble of a torn down house in Windsor, and it happened to be the house of a descendant of Matthew Grant, who was the town's second recorder. The person who found the diary was Oliver Ellsworth's son, and he picked it up and he thought, well, this might be something important. He gave it to his father, who gave it to the local pastor, finally ended up in the hands of James Hammond Trumbull, our first state librarian and historian, and he was able to discover on the inside cover, Alse Young was hanged May the 26th, 1647. So it matched John Winthrop's diary, One of Windsor, and then we had a name for the very first time. But interestingly enough, he only shared this information with a couple male historians. They didn't really think it was, I don't know if they didn't think it was that important, but the public didn't find out about Alse Young until about, it was 1908, 1912. His daughter.
Wow, this is almost 300 years later.
Yes, yes, it is.
150 yeah.
Almost 300 years later, his daughter, Annie Elliott Trumbull, put an article in the Hartford Courant, and that's how the public first heard about her.
And yet she still is not very well known.
No, she's not very well known. And the research that I did over the 2-year period, what I uncovered I thought was just astonishing. And I was working as a labor and delivery nurse at the time. The whole time I was researching, the whole time I eventually started writing too, and I thought, this is so compelling, and I really felt like it was a cover-up. I felt like in some way I'd be just as guilty or have some guilt as the people that hanged her if I didn't get this information out. Because it was, first of all, it was interesting, but it's pertinent to the whole witch trial history, because I did find a connection to the Salem witch trials. And I did find a connection to John Winthrop Jr., who was our governor, who actually was behind stopping the witch trials in Connecticut.
So how long a period of time were there witch trials in Connecticut?
Well, it started with Alse Young in 1647, and the last hanging was 1663, January of 1663, the last people that were hanged in the Hartford witch panic. And then after that, John Winthrop Jr. really put a stop to it.
Well, you brought a video, and I think we're going to watch it because it gives some context and some information about Alse the person, and then we can talk about the issues that come up.
Okay, sounds good. Enjoy. Hello, my name is Beth Caruso, author of One of Windsor. I'm standing in Windsor, Connecticut today, and I'd like to tell you about the final journey of Alse Young, America's first witch hanging victim.
This driveway in Windsor, Connecticut was one of the first roads in a new colony. It was called Backer Row, and was the location where Alse Young lived with her husband, John Young. In the spring of 1647, amidst a devastating influenza epidemic, something went horribly wrong. Alse Young was apprehended as a witch from her home on Backer Row.
Evidence of her wrongdoings were gathered by town leaders and would have been presented here on Windsor's Old Town Green in the first meeting house. The meeting house has since moved to a place across the street and become the first church of Windsor. But a statue of Captain John Mason, a leader in the Pequot War and a treasurer on the Connecticut General Court at the time of Alse Young's hanging, stands on the old Windsor Green today. After Windsor's town leaders decided that their evidence was compelling enough to send Alse Young for a witchcraft trial in Hartford, they would have led her down this street, Old Meadow Road, to a landing on the Farmington River to board a shallop destined for Hartford. Was Alse Young able to notice the wildlife around her? Did she see the trees, the magnificent trees that would have lined the waterways? Or could she only think about her imminent and probable death?
Alse Young would have passed by the old Loomis homestead on her way down the river. Alse would have journeyed only about 2 miles from the old town center on the rivulet before meeting with the Connecticut River, or the Big River. It would take 6 more miles of traveling along the shores of the big river before Alice Young reached her destination in Hartford.
As Alice Young approached Hartford in the vessel that held her captive, she would have seen the old Dutch fort up ahead in the distance. Later, after disembarking, the constable would have led Alice in chains from the waterfront up a hill to the town green, where a jail would serve as her last dwelling on earth. Alice Young was found guilty for the crime of witchcraft. She was probably sentenced to die on the green where the old state house now stands. Alice Young lost her life by hanging on May the 26th, 1647. No one knows how many secrets are held in the ground here at the old state house, for many witch trials followed, and many hangings as well. Alice Young was just the beginning. Thank you for watching Alice Young's final journey.
So, this kind of thing doesn't happen in a vacuum. Like, people don't wake up one day and say, okay, we're terrified of this young woman. She's going to bring ruin on us. We have to, we have to execute her. So I couldn't help but, be struck by the statue of Mason. There was a big controversy about that statue when it was in Mystic many years ago. What's the context that this happened, and what's the connection with John Mason and the Pequot Wars? And I don't know.
Well, a little bit of a long story here, but basically, in the Americas, there had only been one person who was tried for witchcraft and convicted in Virginia in the 1620s, but she had to pay a fine in tobacco, and that was it. The English and Europeans had a long history of burning witches, hanging witches, but since that 1620s case in Virginia, it had been relatively quiet in New England, although there were a lot of fears that built. People were in a brand new wilderness, and they didn't know where the edge of it was, so that scared people. It was filled with animals they didn't understand and were afraid of. They were especially afraid of wolves. They would chop off their heads and tack them onto the meeting house, and they would get a bounty, be paid a bounty for killing a wolf. So they had, the fear of that nature, the unknown. They were starving, quite frankly, a lot of the time because they were just learning to grow their crops. A lot of these people had been city dwellers. There were also the natives that they did not understand at all. They thought they were devil worshippers, basically. When the Pequot War happened, it was a very scary time for both the natives and for the English. The English, because they were starving and they were sick with disease, and they couldn't get outside their palisades or their little forts they would make because they were afraid of Indian attack. But if they didn't grow their crops, they would starve. So there was fear in that way. The Pequot War, that led to a lot of mistrust between the English and the natives, but in the aftermath, there was also a lot of contentious feelings between the group from Massachusetts and the group from Connecticut, because they all wanted land at Mystic. And the people who, the Connecticut people wanted that land for their colony, and vice versa, Massachusetts wanted it. So that led to a lot of divisions. Plus there were diseases. In the year of 1647, the year that Alice Young was hanged, there was a huge flu epidemic. And the year before, I think 6 people had died. And then the year of her hanging, there were over 27 people that died.
And they didn't know about germs or...
No, they had their own healing systems, but they didn't have epidemiology, they didn't have germ theory, they didn't have any of those things. But you were asking me about Mason and his whole connection. He was living in Windsor at the time, and he had been the Connecticut leader, the captain in the Pequot War. And it was interesting because at the time of Alice Young's hanging, he was actually a treasurer on the Connecticut General Court. And in those days, the treasurer would often act as prosecutor. So he may very well have been a prosecutor in Alice Young's case. And we know from, manuscripts that he left behind of his mentality that, his pious Puritan thought the Indians were evil, devil worshippers, and the date of the massacre in the Pequot War, May the 26th, 1637, was exactly 10 years before the hanging of Alice Young, to the exact day, which made me think, was he trying to send a message to the devil, by having her hanging be on the anniversary of the Pequot massacre? But the other interesting thing was, in this build-up to this innocent woman hanging, was they put some laws into place. In 1641 in Massachusetts, they had the first witchcraft law. And then in Connecticut, it was 1642. It was taken straight from the Bible. And if the sentence for being a witch was a hanging, you're to be put to death. So that is in place 5 years before her hanging. And then there's an epidemic in Essex, England, between 1645 and 1647. And Matthew Hopkins was a man who was self-appointed witch-finder general, who led this whole witch hunt in Essex, England. It stopped in 1647, the exact year that Alice Young was hanged, and consequently, he wrote a witch-finding manual. So it's it's not inconsequential that all these things led up to the point in 1647 that Alice Young was hanged.
Now, were any men hanged as witches?
Yes, there were. In Connecticut, there were 11 hangings. 2 of them were men. There were also more accusations, 34 in all, but we don't know for sure because we're finding more records as time goes on. So we're not really sure. And some of those accused who fled or who were acquitted were men as well. But interestingly enough, they were usually husbands.
Okay, so they were implicated with their spouses,
Right.
And not gone after on their own.
No, except in Massachusetts during the Salem witch trials, there were a couple men who were independently stoned to death or hanged.
Now, we were talking about this before the show. You started research on the book a couple years ago, and now it seems as though we're suddenly in our country plunged into not exactly the same mentality that led to these hangings, but there are some disturbing similarities. And I guess we can talk about some of them. Like, where did the idea of scapegoating come from? Like, if there's an epidemic and people are dying or crops fail, where does the idea come from to, like, just say this diabolical person jinxed us?
Well, I'm not exactly sure. I imagine scapegoating has been going on since humans have been communicating with each other. But in that particular era, they had, like we talked about before, they didn't have epidemiology. Sciences were just beginning. So they didn't understand the world around them in the same way that we do, because we have the benefit of science. Also, the communication, it was very slow from town to town, so these rumors, they would start and the news would go from town to town and it would change, and then it would just get out of control. So rumors would fly. I am not as forgiving of people nowadays because we do have the benefit of science. We do have the benefit of rapid communication, but we seem not to pay attention to it. Scapegoating is a mechanism that people can use to explain, in the past anyway, unexplained weather, disease epidemics, even a neighbor's milk turning sour. They got blamed for all kinds of things. But today, I think it's fear. Fear is behind, lack of knowledge about why things are happening. Why am I losing my job?
Right.
Why do I feel left out?
But it is interesting because now we do have, I'm not saying we have the pinnacle of all scientific knowledge, but we have a lot of scientific knowledge which is very easily accessible.
Yes.
And we can communicate, to a point that we hardly even remember when we couldn't, like, answer a dinner table question within 5 minutes doing an internet search.
Right.
But the downside of that is that there's a lot of fake stuff that circulates just as fast and just as convincingly if you can't discriminate.
Yes, and that's a scary thing too, because I think we should be educated enough, but we have become lax and haven't checked sources. I mean, they couldn't check these sources back then in the same way that we can now. 2 minutes, internet search, you can do a lot of verification.
You sure can.
Of sources, and there's no reason why someone shouldn't. And there's no reason why someone shouldn't use many news sources, not just be stuck to one and not listen to the other side. There's no excuse for it nowadays.
No, but it's happening.
It is happening. It is happening. And I guess it's this darker side of our human nature that every generation really has to be vigilant about not letting our fears take over.
And I was a preschool teacher, and I'm retired now, but I used to really be concerned about the sleepless kids and the sleepless parents. When we're tired, our brains really don't work as well. It's hard to focus on making a good, complicated, decision. Or if you're overtired, your blood flow is just not feeding the part of the brain that needs to be. And I do wonder if, working long hours, not getting enough sleep, feeling stressed out about financial issues or your safety or whatever, just really are making us more vulnerable to like easy blame.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, I listed a bunch of stressors that were going on in those colonial times with the Puritans, which would make them feel very fearful. I think we have another whole set of stressors that are difficult for people. We worry about our food. We worry about, environmental contaminants. We worry about all kinds of things, many stressors. The sandwich generation, where parents are living with children who have young children still, and
they're employed.
They're employed full
so
time.
They're getting pulled all over the place.
Yes, I mean, when I grew up, it wasn't necessary for both parents to work. Now it's necessary in most families.
It is.
And that's a huge stressor, which leads to the decline in the quality of food that you are eating at your house. So there's a lot more fast food, not as nutritious, not as much time to prepare.
And people aren't sitting around the table just conversing very much.
No, it seems like there's always something going on.
Now, looking at the book, I kept thinking about things that were happening then that, in addition to the stressors we're seeing a lot of parallels now. And it seemed as though New England culture, Puritan culture, was very authoritarian. And we're seeing kind of, I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and I don't think I've seen so much authoritarianism in politics or even in social situations as I'm starting to see now.
No, it is alarming, because if you really look at those Puritan times, it was not a great thing to have that level of intolerance. I mean, if you were Baptist, you got chased out of town. Quakers, you had to go to the meeting house, whether you agreed with what the ministers were saying. You got fines slapped on you, punishments, put in the stocks, whippings if you did not conform to be like everyone else. And what happens in those type of situations? Well, human beings are still going to be human beings, but then you can't express yourself openly. So a lot of things happen behind closed doors. And it saddens me that we should get to a point in our democracy where people should have to feel like that again.
But I feel as though there are a lot of groups that are almost being driven back behind closed doors. We've seen there's so much anti-immigrant
Yes.
Feeling right now. I feel as though there's a level of misogyny going on now that I have not felt, I don't think, maybe not in my whole life. So it's kind of disturbing to see that we thought this was over.
Yes.
And it wasn't, and it isn't over. It's sort of coming more out into the open, this kind of authoritarian.
Right. And we have to remember that in our Constitution, a lot of these things, a lot of the things in the Constitution were in rejection of those puritanical ways of thinking, where it was important to put in separation of church and state. Because when it was a puritanical state, a religious state, it didn't work out for people so well, at least not people like Alice Young, not
Right.
for homosexuals. The crime for
Yeah.
homosexuality back then was hanging.
Whoa.
Yeah, there were a lot of things that had to be behind closed doors.
Well, and the First Amendment, as you know, feels like it's very much under attack right now. We're seeing a lot of religious influence on policy. I think about reproductive rights, and it's like there's no medical reason why, in my opinion, why the government should be, inserting itself into medical and personal matters, and yet we might be seeing some cabinet appointments who are going to make it really hard.
Yes.
So you mentioned the connection with the Pequot War, and I also feel as though that's another thing we haven't really resolved right now, how Western European-born or descended Americans and our relationship with the Native Americans, the whole North Dakota pipeline struggle has kind of been front and center in a lot of the news now. And I wonder, does it seem like history's repeating itself in some ways to you?
Well, to tell you the truth, when I studied for this book and learned more about the Pequot War, I was shocked that so much of it was not represented accurately in history books. And I say this even from just looking at resources of the English. They were very brutal. They went, and you hear this story about the Pequot aggression. There was some of that, but there was a lot of English aggression. They got accused of killing a trader, and this trader had actually been banned in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were so horrified by him because he had slept with someone's wife, and he had sworn at Roger Ludlow, who was then in the Massachusetts court.
Oh my God.
And they banned him. And so they were really, really itching for a reason to go to war with the Pequots, because my earrings here, these are the shells that wampum was made from. Wampum was the monetary equivalent that was used by a lot of the early settlers. The natives used the shells for the wampum was used in trade, but it was also something sacred too. So it wasn't exactly the same, but they controlled the area where these shells were, and so they were the ones making the wampum. There wasn't a lot of coinage in those days, so settlers, by and large, they were using wampum a lot of the time. Wow. And the English were very motivated to get these lands so they could control these shells. The Pequot, they gave the wampum to all the other tribes in trade, and the English did not want them to have as much power. Plus, they wanted this land. So when this trader was killed, because he basically kidnapped some Niantic Indians, and they killed, they wanted revenge. So he died, but this was the same guy who was banned from going to Massachusetts Bay Colony, but they jumped on that opportunity. They accused the Pequots of doing it. They said, no, we didn't do it, but they were related to the other tribe. So
they all look alike,
so
right?
I guess they took the rap. They were a cousin tribe. So, and there were raids before this big massacre. There were raids, and there was food insecurity for the natives too, because with these English raids, they would take their corn, they would take other food sources. At the same time, the English were starving, so they wanted those to bring them back. So they had their secret motivations. And, you know, they won the war, and it wasn't, you know, it was pretty brutal. It wasn't considered quite fair. They basically entrapped the natives in a fort, and they burned the fort.
And that was women and children as well.
Women and children. And there were allied tribes who were aligned with the English, who were enemies of the Pequot. But they stood and watched and were aghast and basically made comments about how brutal the English fought their wars and were stunned. And it was a very chilling effect. And from there on out, the English really did control the area.
Well, I think you do see that I'm sure the English felt that the natives weren't really quite human. You know, it's very dehumanizing way of looking at people. But seems like about 30 years ago, I took a course on early American literature, and most of the early American literature is awful, and it is some of these old journals. And
Yes.
I remember reading about Mason and the Pequot massacre, and in their own words, it was just horrific.
It was, and I didn't know until doing this research that the women and children after the war, they made them into slaves. Most of the Pequot men died, but the ones that lived, they decided to trade them for African slaves and that's when the first African slaves came up to New England. It was right after the Pequot War. These natives were traded, and the reason for that being is a lot of the natives, they knew the lay of the land, you know. They could quickly assimilate into another tribe. A lot of them were indeed cousins, and slip away from the English. But if they brought in Africans instead, well, they didn't know the lay of the land, they didn't know the plants, they couldn't just mix into
And they were separated
another
from their
tribe.
families and their support systems as well.
Right, absolutely. So they were easier to control because of that. You know, there was still defiance in other ways, and I was shocked to realize the extent of enslavement of Native Americans after that war.
And that persisted into the 1700s, perhaps?
Well, because of the reasons I stated, the Native Americans didn't make as
Right.
it didn't work out as well. But yes, they enslaved them. I can't tell you exactly the year that they stopped, but I've understand that Mason had a day of Thanksgiving after taking over with this massacre, and this just continued. This has continued throughout our history with many different tribes taking over their land, taking over their resources. I heard today that there were some people on Trump's staff that were talking about revoking the land leases for Native American tribes with the Department of Indian Affairs, because a lot of those reservations are sitting on huge amounts of oil and other resources. I can't imagine doing that. And I hope those days are over. I hope they're over, but I am concerned.
It seems as though there is good reason to be concerned right now. So you mentioned different factions of English that came over to this area, both to Boston and to Connecticut. And immigration has been a big subject of discussion here recently, discussions of building walls to keep people out. And can you just briefly maybe talk about why people came here?
Well, they came here for religious freedom, but their own religious freedom. The Puritans, once they got here, they wanted to dictate to everyone else what they should believe and how they should believe it. So, and they were operating on the doctrine of discovery, which had, I can't remember the exact year it originated, but it basically was a papal edict saying, you can go to foreign lands and conquer the native people there. If they don't convert to Christianity, then they can be enslaved or they can be murdered, basically.
Now, this was a period of time that was when there were the witch trials in this country that was extended, but it didn't last forever. So as we have some concerns about what period we're in right now, what's a way out of this climate of fear or, atmosphere where you're scapegoating and, in competition and doing destructive things?
I think when you hear something, don't just get right on the bandwagon. Really look at why things are happening. Look at a bunch of different sources and try and figure that out. Like I said, I think it is part of our innate human nature that we have to overcome fear and we have to overcome scapegoating, because scapegoating is an easy way to just explain everything. In reality, nothing is as simple as scapegoating would dictate it is. So we have to be vigilant about that part of our own dark side, I would say.
And I think there's a lot at stake here, because we seem to be very afraid, but kind of afraid of the wrong things. There are some real challenges we're facing these days, and it's not easy, it's not going to be useful to just place blame for it. We have to move forward.
No.
Yeah. So, we were talking earlier about climate change. This is a huge challenge we face, and are we going to worry about, women who have miscarriages, and worried about gay marriage, and worried about immigrants, just taking everyone's job away while, the waters rise and potable water becomes a scarce resource? So, what do we do? Now we have, I don't know, a little more than five. We have 8 minutes. That's not bad.
Okay.
So I was curious. So why was Alse the person that came under suspicion? What kind of characteristics did people who get targeted have?
Very good question. Well, a lot of the women, and it was mostly women who were targeted. Some were widows, and they had no male heir, and there was land that other people wanted, so they would get accused of witchcraft. I don't think that was the case with Alse Young. She did have one daughter, but she was married at the time, so her husband was still alive. She wasn't a widow. From my research, I can't absolutely prove it, but I do think she was a healer. And there was the first doctor who lived in Windsor may have been in competition with her. So it may have been something that had to do with that. His name was Bray Rossiter, and interestingly enough, he was the first person to do an autopsy in the New World. The place and time he did the autopsy was during the Hartford witch panic, with the first woman that died. They were trying to prove that she died from witchcraft. So he did an autopsy, and he said that, yes, she did die from witchcraft. That's what his
really
autopsy showed.
In the details. How do you know?
So that was very interesting. So competition with men. Some of the other women had been shown to be healers. They had been accused because of that. Someone who was more of a lower class, maybe someone who had been a servant, or someone who had been accused of a previous crime. Now, in Alice's situation, like I said, I think there's a lot of historical record that says there was a flu epidemic that happened that year, and a lot of people died. So if you're a healer, you can imagine maybe you're helping people, but if you have a huge flu epidemic coming in, maybe you are running out of your herbal stores, or it's just too overwhelming to deal with. Maybe she actually had saved a lot of people, but it was still so bad that there was a lot of death. Also, I feel that she was connected to this one family called the Tinkers, and you can kind of tell that because of where she lived on a street called Backer Row. All the people around her were part of this Tinker family. Well, that's where you get into the political part of this witch hanging accusation. In this family was a man named John Tinker, who was the assistant to our governor, John Winthrop Jr. And John Winthrop Jr. was often at odds, going back to Captain Mason, because Mason wanted the Pequots completely subdued. He didn't want them to exist as a tribe anymore. And here comes along John Winthrop Jr. from Massachusetts. He settles New London, and the Pequot tribe survives. Well, Mason doesn't like it. So they're butting heads with each other, and here is this man, John Tinker, who is with, he had worked for his father, John Winthrop, which most of this Windsor group had wanted to get away from. And then he's now working for John Winthrop Jr. And I think he was connected to Alice as a family member, extended family member. So I think it was very political as well.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left. I wanted to ask you one more question, and I'm sorry I'm not giving you much time to answer it. But when you write a book like this, where does the history end and the fiction start?
A lot of the book I based on the real research that I found. The literary invention came in where I just had to intuitively figure out how to piece it together, where I had to fill it in. But I tried to be as authentic to the research, or as consistent with the research as possible.
And in the case of Alice, we do know where she came from, or we have a good idea where she came from, where she settled, and where she died ultimately.
Well, that was part of the research. There's no direct evidence for her, so it was piecing together a lot of different pieces, like a jigsaw puzzle.
Now, if people want to know more without themselves going to the vaults, where's the source of information? You probably have a website, right?
Yes, I have a website. It's www.oneofwindsor.com. And from there, I list a lot of resources where people can do their own research. Stanley Whitman House, They have the largest collection of witchcraft trial history in Connecticut. So that's a really great place to go.
Well, thank you, Beth. I don't know if we covered everything, but we covered a lot.
We covered a lot.
And I read a little bit of the book, and it's a pretty compelling story, and it's it's local, which is quite amazing to me. So thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
Next week, we're slated to have Deborah Cohen, and she has traveled to North Dakota to be at Standing Rock twice now, and she's going to share her experiences. So that's actually a good follow-up to this.
Yeah.
So we'll see you next week, and thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Dream